35-year-old Judy Moylanen checked one more time that her 3-year-old daughter was safely buckled into her car seat, and then, with a sigh of relief, Judy climbed into the passenger seat of the van and nodded to her husband Bruce, who was at the wheel, letting him know that they were now ready to go. The car engine was already on, and the inside of the vehicle was nice and warm, and in another minute, they had backed down the driveway of their neat brick ranch house directly onto US Route 41. It was Thanksgiving Day, November 26th, 1992, and even now, hours before they would sit down to the traditional turkey dinner and prayer of gratitude, Judy was already feeling a little unaccustomed rush of happiness as she and Bruce headed west along 41 towards Judy's parents' house where they would spend the holiday weekend. Just 2 days ago, Judy had wondered if this trip would even be possible. Here, in Michigan's remote Upper Peninsula, Thanksgiving is almost overshadowed by the state's 2-week-long deer hunting season that spans the last 2 weeks of November. It's a time when the biggest fashion trend is blaze orange, and even visitors to the little town of Harvey, where the Moylanens lived, were more likely to ask each other, "Did you get your buck yet?" than they were to just wave and say hello. And on the first day of hunting season, Bruce had managed to bring home a male deer with a good-sized rack of antlers. But on the drive back to their house after he was finished hunting, Bruce had hit another deer that was crossing the road, and that collision had totaled the Moylanens' Subaru station wagon. And it wasn't until the day just before Thanksgiving that the couple had been able to find and place a down payment on a replacement vehicle large enough to carry all of their luggage, as well as their 4 dogs. Unlike Judy's job as an assistant hospital administrator at nearby Marquette General Hospital, Bruce's side gig as a dog trainer meant that the family required a car that could accommodate several dog crates as well as 3 passengers. And the tan Chevrolet van was definitely comfortable as well as roomy. Within just a few minutes of starting their 2.5-hour drive, Elise had already dropped off to sleep. And with Bruce focused on how their new vehicle handled, Judy had a rare opportunity to just sit there and let her mind wander. Day to day, Judy's work was very demanding and she put in long hours. Even coupled with his dog training business and freelance work as an insurance claim adjuster, Bruce's main job as an instrument technician for Marquette General Hospital did not bring in as much money as Judy's regular paycheck. Not that Judy looked or acted the part of the traditional family breadwinner. Compared to her husband, who was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and 180 pounds, Judy was just 5 foot 4 inches tall, with short, curly, light brown hair, and a quiet but practical manner. But behind Judy's oversized glasses, her eyes sparkled when she smiled. And she smiled a lot, just as she was quick to laugh at other people's jokes. And although Judy never sought out the social spotlight, in fact, that kind of attention would have just made her feel uncomfortable, her ability to listen and respond in ways that made others around her shine meant that people just really loved Judy and liked being around her. And there had always been more to Judy than met the eye. She adored her parents and her 2 brothers, and she was looking forward to spending the upcoming weekend chatting comfortably inside the snug family home with her mom and sister-in-law while Elise played with her cousins. But, like her younger brothers, Judy was also an outdoors person. Ever since she could walk, the woods in the back of her parents' home had been Judy's playground. And growing up in Ontonagon, with a population of just 2,000 people and a business district that did not have one single stoplight, there had been plenty of woods as well as fields and streams to explore. And so during that time, Judy had become very comfortable outdoors. She had also become skilled at handling firearms. So, in addition to enjoying plenty of time in the kitchen and in front of the fireplace, Judy was also looking forward to getting out in the forest with Bruce and her dad and brothers to do some hunting of their own. Hunting wasn't the only outdoor sport that Judy was really good at. She was also an excellent skier. In fact, it was that passion that had brought her and Bruce together back in 1974 when Judy was 17 and Bruce, who lived in a town even smaller than Ontonagon, was 20. But good as Judy was on skis, Bruce was even better. And at Porcupine Mountain, located right on the edge of Lake Superior, Bruce's ability and job with the ski patrol conferred a lot of status on a young man whose mother had barely scraped up the money to put food on the table for their 4 children, and whose father spent a lot of time at the local bars. So, at first glance, Judy and Bruce had been an unlikely couple. Overcoming his difficult childhood, Bruce had grown into a cocky and outgoing young man who never hesitated to speak his mind. Judy, on the other hand, came from a deeply religious, deeply conservative family whose morals and religious beliefs she shared. Her parents, Dale and Marianne Blake, had been high school sweethearts whose first child, Judy, had been born when Marianne was 21. Together, and for the last 40 years, the Blakes had owned and operated their own small automobile and oil business called Dale's Service. And as the Blake family grew with the arrival of Judy's two brothers, Marianne had supplemented their income with her job at First National Bank in Ontonagon, and then with the job she held now at Lake Superior Credit Union. But when it came to Judy's social life, even without her parents' tendency to be overprotective of their only daughter, Judy herself preferred reading and arts and crafts to parties and dating, just as she would have chosen a good piece of pie and a cold glass of milk over a bottle of beer and a bowl of peanuts. But when Judy and Bruce both wound up attending Northern Michigan University in Marquette at the same time, the attraction between them was irresistible. And on June 24th, 1978, 4 years after meeting on the slopes of Porcupine Mountain, Bruce and Judy were married. Afterward, the couple stayed in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, but they moved 120 miles east to Harvey. Once there, Judy established her career at the nearby Marquette General Hospital. Bruce, who started out in healthcare as an emergency medical technician, eventually took the instrument technician job at Marquette General Hospital. Along the way, Bruce had established North County Claims Service, a small independent insurance business, and Big Creek Kennels. And 11 years after exchanging their wedding vows, the couple had added to the ranks of the Blake and Moylannon families with the birth of their first and so far only child, Elise, now napping soundly in the back seat of the 1987 Chevrolet van. Just the thought of her daughter always made Judy smile. And ever since Judy had suffered a serious concussion in a freak accident the year before, she had been reminded all over again about the importance of family and friends. She knew how happy her own parents would be to have their adult children, plus all 6 grandchildren, together under one roof for this holiday weekend. Not to mention the added excitement of 4 extra dogs, all Springer Spaniels, just like her parents' dog, Streak. But even as Judy looked forward to the Blake family reunion and good food that now lay just 2 hours ahead of them in a hometown that she had always loved, she could not entirely ignore that sense of dread that had become so familiar to her. And it was just not a feeling that she had been able to share with her family or with Bruce. He was handy around the house, great about taking care of Elise when Judy's workdays stretched to 12 hours, and he was also a better cook than she was. But discussing and exploring their innermost thoughts was not one of his strengths. Looking over at her husband now, his big familiar hands firmly on the wheel, Judy reminded herself that this was not the time to worry. This was the time for her and Bruce to relax, take stock of their lives and blessings, and spend time together over the long weekend. And sure enough, after Thursday's wonderful Thanksgiving celebration, Judy and Bruce were able to put in 2 full days of hunting together while Elise enjoyed the attention of her grandmother and Marianne's own mother, Elise's great-grandmother Nemi. So on Friday, while Judy's brothers headed for their deer camp about 16 miles south, Bruce and Judy decided to try their luck at a hunting spot even further away. But at Dishnot Creek, their attempts to drive deer out of cover were unsuccessful, and so were the hours they spent sitting quietly in small camouflage shacks called blinds. So by late afternoon, Judy was ready to call it a day. The falling darkness and the sound of howling coyotes suddenly made her wish she was back at home instead of growing stiff with cold in these unfamiliar woods. But even as she stepped out of her blind to call out to Bruce, from behind her there was the sound of a gunshot. Down a small hill and across the creek in front of her, Bruce was so alarmed by the sudden noise he practically leapt out of his blind, hoping it was Judy who had fired at a deer. Instead, he saw his wife approaching through the dark, just carrying her flashlight, not her rifle. The shot had been so close to where Judy was standing that the whole episode shook both of them. It was a reminder of just how dangerous hunters could be, not just to the wildlife, but to other hunters. After that, Judy and Bruce abandoned their blinds and headed back to their van. The next morning, which was Saturday, the couple felt much better, and so Bruce and Judy did not need any persuading to go hunting again. But this time, they decided to go with other family members rather than striking out on their own again. Especially with hunting season about to close, everyone knew there were bound to be some hunters out in the woods who were going to be shooting at anything just to get that last buck. And by the time Judy woke up on Sunday morning, her only regret of the weekend was that her 4-day holiday was just hours from being over. She and Bruce had both come back empty-handed from hunting the day before, but better that, Judy thought, than just wounding a deer. That's what had happened to her cousin Mike, who had asked Bruce to get up early that morning and go back into the woods to see if they could find this wounded deer and put it out of its misery. As for Judy, while Bruce was out hunting, dropping in on some friends, and running errands before their return trip that evening back to Harvey, Judy was content to stay home with her sisters-in-law, her mom, and Grandma Nemi. After her mother had served up their traditional post-Thanksgiving lunch of turkey casserole, Judy was also glad to have the chance to give her mom a break. So, after everyone had finished eating, Judy urged her mother to take some time alone in her little office to relax and catch up on some bookkeeping for work, while Judy cleaned up and did the dishes. By about 1:15 p.m., Judy had the kitchen and dining room all squared away. Hanging the dish towel on its usual hook, Judy glanced at her watch and decided that now was a good time for her to take the 5 dogs out for their afternoon walk. Her younger brother, Jerry, and his family, who lived 4 hours away in Wisconsin, were planning to leave on Tanagan by 2:30, so Judy had just about an hour before she needed to be back with the dogs. As Judy pulled on her black down jacket, her parents' dog, Streak, was practically dancing with excitement at the signs that he was about to go outside. But it was the 4 much more obedient Moylanen dogs kenneled outside who really needed the exercise. They were the ones with a long night of travel ahead. Judy didn't bother with a leash. This was 1992 and the Upper Peninsula, and dogs were free to run around. A few minutes later, Judy called out a goodbye to her mom and opened the door to step out into the thick woods just beyond the edge of her parents' backyard. As she did, she pulled her coat tighter around herself. Not only was it already below freezing outside, but the air was so damp it felt even colder, and the afternoon clouds completely blocked the sun. An hour later, at 2:15 p.m., Jerry and his wife had their car all packed and ready to go. The only thing they had left to do was to wait for Judy so they could say their final goodbyes before heading home. And that is when the Blakes looked out the back window of the kitchen and saw Streak come running out of the woods, tongue lolling and tail wagging. Except that Streak was all alone. Judy and the other 4 dogs were nowhere to be seen. By 4 p.m., Judy's mother knew there was something wrong. For the past hour and a half, Mary Ann had been telling herself that Streak, who was not nearly as well trained as Judy and Bruce's dogs, must have just decided it was time to go home. And Judy was probably still out in the woods thinking Streak was out there too, lost or just wandering around. But by 4:20, Mary Ann knew she was clutching at straws. There was just no way that Judy would stay out this long walking the dogs or looking for Streak, and no way she would have missed saying goodbye to Jerry and his family. So, with Bruce and Mary Ann's husband and her other son and his family all out of the house, Mary Ann decided to leave little Elise with her great-grandma Nemi and go find Judy herself. And minutes later, Mary Ann was at the door putting on her coat and boots, but Mary Ann's first attempt to find her daughter failed. In fact, when Mary Ann had blown the dog whistle she brought with her, the sight of the 4 dogs running in her direction and still no sign of Judy had only served to turn Mary Ann's sense of worry into outright fear. And by the time she had managed to get the dogs back in their kennels and return to the woods, Mary Ann was on the verge of tears. So she didn't hesitate when her neighbor, Bill Dorvanen, who had seen the older woman picking her way into the woods, offered to help with the search. And grabbing his flashlight, Bill now led the 2 of them deeper into the woods. It was about 5 p.m., and the sun was just 10 minutes away from setting when Bill saw Judy's body. Mary Ann's only daughter was right in front of them, lying across the trail on her left side, her eyes open and blank in the glare of the flashlight. Judy's head was resting on a slight rise, and her feet were partly submerged in a pool of icy water. When Bill carefully turned Judy over onto her back, her arms fell to either side, and a moment later, both Bill and behind him, Mary Ann, could see that Judy's upper right chest was completely soaked in dark red blood. It didn't take long for the local sheriff's deputy and emergency medical technicians who had responded to Bill's 911 call to confirm what Bill and a hysterical Mary Ann already knew, that Judy was dead. In fact, by the time those first responders had reached the scene at about 5:20 p.m., Judy's body was already showing signs of rigor mortis, a stiffening of her limbs that suggested Judy may have already been dead for as long as 3.5 hours. Before the medics removed Judy's body, Sheriff's Deputy Tom Cusino had done the best he could to gather any evidence of what might have happened to Judy. Even though it looked like a tragic hunting accident, law enforcement would still need to find out exactly what happened and who may have fired the stray bullet that had killed Judy. But even though the deputy had made sure to take plenty of pictures of Judy's body and the surrounding area, all he could really see were scattered leaves and dog prints. And he already knew from talking to the Blakes' neighbor that one critical piece of evidence, the original position of the victim's body, had already been compromised when Bill had shifted Judy's body to check for signs of life. Now, after taking Marianne to stay with another neighbor, Bill had rejoined the deputy and told him everything that Marianne had said about why she was out in the woods looking for her daughter in the first place, how Judy's walk with the dogs had lasted far too long, and how Streak had come without Judy. In answer to the deputy's questions, Bill said no, this was not an area where people generally went hunting. It was too populated and too close to the 8 or 9 families like the Blakes and Dorvanens that lived right behind the woods on Cherry Lane. Then, together with one of the ambulance drivers, all 3 men used flashlights to search for any sign of the bullet or bullets that had nearly ripped Judy's body in half. It seemed likely that the shot had come from a rifle, a type of gun that ejects its spent shell casings after firing, but after tramping around in the woods in the dark, the search did not turn up either a casing or a bullet. And so, after marking the area for further investigation, by 6 p.m., Deputy Cusino was ready to give the order for Judy's body to be removed from the scene, placed in the ambulance, and transported to the county morgue that was located inside Marquette General Hospital. Deputy Cusino already knew that the 12-person Ontonagon Sheriff's Department, which did not include crime scene techs, would have to get help from the state to investigate Judy's death. And that call for assistance went out to State Police Sergeant Detective Bill Ball at about 6:40 p.m., a little over 5 hours after Judy had left her parents' home to go walk the dogs. After getting the message that a woman had been found dead out and back of Cherry Lane in Ontonagon, 67 miles to the south, the 21-year veteran investigator immediately hopped into his cruiser. And an hour and a quarter later, Detective Ball was standing in the Ontonagon Sheriff's Department, listening intently to Deputy Cusino summarize what law enforcement had found and done so far. Detective Ball had a well-earned reputation for not making assumptions about the cases he worked on, and for being tenacious about gathering the facts he felt he needed before reaching any conclusions. So, after going to view Judy's body in the morgue, the investigator did not immediately agree with the deputy medical examiner's suggestion that, like most shootings in the Upper Peninsula during deer hunting season, this death was accidental. And even if it turned out to be accidental, Detective Ball intended to find out how it had happened and whose bullet had actually killed Judy. So, even though it was now pitch dark, Detective Ball, along with 8 other members of local law enforcement, including the sheriff and Deputy Cusino, headed back into the woods behind the Blake house where Judy's body had been found. And this time, using higher-powered flashlights, the searchers found something that the deputy's earlier search had missed. About 37 feet west of where Judy's body had been found, the sheriff was standing under a maple tree and pointing upwards with his flashlight at a fresh horizontal scar in the tree bark. Looking at that mark, both the sheriff and the detective knew they had just gotten their first potential break in the case. Because if that slash on the tree had been made by the bullet that killed Judy, then maybe they could figure out the bullet's trajectory and find the bullet as well as a spent shell casing that would help them identify what kind of weapon killed Judy. Detective Ball decided to order tracking dogs out at the scene for 9 a.m. the next morning, but in the meantime, at about 10:30 p.m., the detective decided it was time to talk with the grieving family. Deputy Cusino, who had informed the Blakes and Judy's husband at about 5 p.m. that Judy had been killed, now joined the detective, and a few minutes later, the 2 men were walking out of the woods towards the Blakes' home on Cherry Lane. Looking up at the lighted windows of the house in front of him, Detective Ball was already especially interested in one particular person, Judy's husband, Bruce. Because in every case involving the death of a wife or husband, the first suspect is always the spouse. A few minutes later, the investigators were seated at the Blakes' kitchen table. Judy's mother, Mary Ann, had been given a sedative to control her hysteria, so the investigators conducted their initial interview with only 3 family members: Judy's father, Dale, her brother, David, who lived with his family in Ontonagon, and with Bruce. According to Deputy Casino, Bruce had been dumbfounded by the news of his wife's death, and one of his first questions to the deputy had been to ask if his wife had been wearing a blaze orange when she was found in the woods. After being told no, Bruce had leaned his forehead against the hospital wall and gently pounded his fists into its hard surface. Looking now at the stunned faces staring back at him from across the table, Detective Ball kept his questions short and to the point. He was just here to collect first impressions, find out when Judy was last seen, and to find out where each of these people he was speaking to were earlier that afternoon. By the time he left the house a half hour later, Detective Ball knew one thing for sure. Every person at that table appeared to have a solid alibi for the 4.5-hour window between the time Judy left the house to walk the dogs and the time when her body was discovered. On Tuesday, December 1st, one day after the end of Michigan's deer hunting season, and 2 days after Judy's death, one of Michigan's biggest newspapers ran a story with the headline, "Deer Season Gets Safer." In that article, which attributed 4 deaths and 25 injuries to hunting accidents in the 1992 season that had just come to an end, Judy's death was listed as a possible 5th accidental fatality, but one that was currently being investigated by local and state law enforcement. Ontonagon sheriff was quoted in the paper as appealing to anyone with information to please come forward. And 1 day later, on Wednesday, December 2nd, the day of Judy's funeral service in Ontonagon, Detective Ball received a phone call from the police department in Marquette, where Judy lived and worked. An officer there was passing along information from an anonymous caller, information that made Detective Ball decide it was time to head for Marquette to take a closer look into Judy's work life as well as her personal life. In the meantime, local officers were able to pinpoint the likely time of Judy's death to about 2 p.m. That's the time that several residents in the area had each heard a single gunshot coming from the woods behind Cherry Lane on November 29th. Detective Ball also had officers check out other leads, possible criminals who had recently been released from police custody, reports of unidentified or strange people in the area where Judy was found, and reports of anyone in that area who was seen carrying firearms. In addition, assuming now that Judy had been killed at around 2 p.m., Detective Ball ordered officers to double-check every alibi provided to them by Judy's husband, father, brothers, and cousins, along with the alibis of any other family member who was not actually inside of the Blake household when Judy was shot. But it was Detective Ball's decision to call in an Ontonagon civilian to assist in the investigation that would eventually give police their first real breakthrough. Armed with his metal detector, 42-year-old Dan Castle had earned a reputation among Ontonagon law enforcement for being able to recover hard-to-find evidence lost in the Upper Peninsula's dense forests. Now, on Thursday, December 3rd, Dan Castle was standing with Detective Ball and Deputy Casino at the exact place behind Cherry Lane where Judy's body had been discovered. A chemical wash applied to the blaze mark on the maple tree 37 feet away had revealed the presence of lead, a metal that is commonly found in bullets. Now, the man with a passion for finding buried treasure had the difficult, if not impossible, assignment of finding the bullet that had passed through Judy's body and then ricocheted off of that tree 5 days earlier. And while Dan was looking for that bullet, Detective Ball headed for Marquette County, where the Moylanens lived and worked. If Judy's death had not been an accident, the detective needed to find out who might have wanted her dead and why. It didn't take long for the state police investigator to realize that the anonymous caller had been right. Judy's life and Judy's past were much more complicated than Bruce and her family had led them to believe. Judy's co-workers and supervisors at the Marquette General Hospital would soon tell detectives why it had taken almost 2 weeks for the Moylanens to replace the station wagon Bruce had totaled on the first day of hunting season. According to the rumor mill, Judy was facing some serious financial issues, and just scraping together $500 for a down payment on the 5-year-old replacement van had been a big challenge. It would also turn out that Judy had recently contacted several of her creditors to ask about restructuring her loans. And when the bank turned down her application to refinance the couple's mortgage, Judy had mentioned to one of her coworkers that she and Bruce might be facing bankruptcy. But aside from learning about the Moylannons' financial problems, when it came to suspects in what could either be an accident or murder, the investigation seemed to be hitting one dead end after another. None of the reports of other hunters or suspicious people in or near the place where Judy died had turned up any viable leads. As for Judy's husband and other family members, police had not been able to find any hard evidence that would link any of them to Judy's death. Not only had Judy's husband, Bruce, prepared a list of people who could verify his whereabouts on November 29th, he had also willingly signed off on a consent to search form. That form gave police permission to examine and inventory Bruce's collection of firearms, as well as examine Judy's various life insurance policies, the payout from which could have provided a motive for Bruce to kill his wife. It would not be until mid-December that the state police investigator would get a series of tips that, together, would break the case wide open. The first of those tips came from Dan Castle up in Ontonagon. For 9 frustrating days, all Dan had found in the woods behind Cherry Lane were bottle caps and old coins. But on Sunday, December 13th, exactly 2 weeks after Judy was shot, Dan decided that before giving up the search for the bullet, he would try a simple physics experiment to pinpoint exactly where the bullet might have come to Earth. So, trading his metal detector for a slingshot and a pocket full of marbles, Dan stood in the exact location where Judy's body had been found and stooped to what he guessed would have been a point level with Judy's chest, where the bullet likely entered her body. Once in this position, Dan fired marble after marble at the blaze mark on the maple tree, and each time the marble ricocheted off the blaze, he made a careful note of where the marble landed. Once he had a cluster of marbles all in the same general area, Dan pocketed his slingshot and again took up his metal detector. And sure enough, in that area where the marbles had clustered, just 77 feet away from the maple tree and buried under a 2-inch layer of snow, Dan discovered a fresh bullet lying on top of the dead leaves that blanketed the ground. Dan grabbed his radio, and an hour later, Detective Ball was standing in the woods with Dan, both of them looking down at this critical new piece of evidence. And when the Marquette State Police Crime Lab ballistics expert arrived for work the next morning, Detective Ball was there waiting, sealed evidence bag in hand. And before the day was out, Detective Ball had 2 more important pieces of information. Crime tech experts had confirmed the .30 caliber bullet that Dan had recovered had in fact killed Judy. Embedded inside the bullet were not only traces of wood from the maple tree, but also fibers from the jacket and shirt that Judy had been wearing the day she was shot. The analysis also showed that Judy's death was no accident. According to the ballistics expert, the bullet was still rising as it passed through Judy's body before ricocheting off the maple tree, which meant it had been fired not from some great distance away, but at close range, and by someone who had put the sights of their guns squarely on Judy's chest. And by the end of that day, the lab had also provided Detective Ball with a list of guns that could have fired a .30 caliber bullet and left distinctive markings that matched the ones they found on this particular bullet. On the same day that Dan Castle had discovered the bullet that killed Judy, Detective Ball received a final tip from a hospital administrator at Portage Hospital in Hancock, Michigan, about 2 hours north of Marquette General Hospital, where Judy also had a job in hospital administration. 36-year-old Gail Lampinen wanted to talk with police about a person who she claimed had been stalking her and who also might have a connection to Judy's death. 2 weeks later, Detective Ball would hear a similar story about the same stalker from another hospital employee, Judy's good childhood friend, Leanne Wysocki, who was employed as a nurse at Marquette General Hospital. But it wasn't until Gail opened a box of sweaters that this stalker had given her as a gift that the police were able to connect all this information together to finally uncover the identity of the person who killed Judy Moylannon. And what they discovered would become one of the most sensational crime stories to ever come out of Michigan's remote and mysterious Upper Peninsula. Based on Detective Ball's investigation into the information provided by these 2 women, Here is a recreation of what happened to Judy Moylannon on the last day of her life, Sunday afternoon, November 29th, 1992. After spending the morning inside the house, helping her mother prepare the traditional Sunday after Thanksgiving lunch of turkey casserole and then washing up the dishes afterward, Judy was glad for the chance to get outside and take all 5 dogs for a walk in the woods that she loved. Even though Streak was not as well trained as the Moylannon's dogs, Judy figured he would stay with the pack as they walked. And if he didn't, Judy knew there was only one place Streak would go, and that was home to her parents' house. As Judy let her dogs out of their kennels behind the house, she pulled her black down coat a little tighter around her. Even after the scare she and Bruce had had when they were out hunting on Friday at Dishnaw Creek, when that bullet from behind them had come so close to where Judy stood near her hunting blind, Judy still hadn't bothered to put on a blaze orange safety vest for this walk with the dogs. Unlike Dishnaw Creek, the woods she now stepped into were too close to the houses on Cherry Lane to attract any hunters. And so, as Judy and the dogs stepped into the woods, the bright pink of her shirt collar was quickly swallowed up among the trees. But to Judy's killer, it wouldn't have mattered if the 35-year-old mother was wearing an entire outfit of blaze orange, because the murderer was not hiding in the woods that afternoon to hunt. The murderer, who was maybe just 50 yards from the path Judy was most likely to follow, was there to kill. And at this distance, hitting Judy was going to be an easy shot. And when it was all over, the murderer was confident that it would look like just another tragic deer hunting accident. Stray bullets had been known to travel so far in these woods that the hunters who fired them would have no idea that they might have struck a human and not a deer. And besides, Judy already appeared to be a very accident-prone person. She had a 5-inch long scar on her head from a concussion that happened a year earlier, and after that, there had been a fire in the Moylannon house that could have done some serious damage if the smell of smoke hadn't caused Judy to wake up and put the fire out. And whatever the risks, once this was done, once the killer had gotten rid of Judy, the killer would then be able to concentrate on 2 other women, Gail Lampinen and Leanne Wysocki. The first time Judy passed by the killer's hideout, the killer only raised their rifle and aimed, placing the sights on Judy's chest, but not pulling the trigger. This trail led to a field where the dogs could run, and then Judy would pass this way again on her way back to her parents' house. Better to wait, so anyone back at the house wouldn't connect the sound of a shot to Judy just having left for her walk. Sure enough, a few minutes after 2 p.m., the killer could hear Judy and the dogs once again approaching the killer's hiding place. This time, when the killer leveled their sights on the side of Judy's chest, they pulled the trigger. The gunshot seemed to echo like a bolt of thunder through the quiet woods, and one of the dogs immediately broke from the pack and ran in the direction of the Blake house on Cherry Lane. Even as the killer ran through the woods to the nearby empty lot where they had parked their vehicle, the killer knew they'd been lucky. Instead of giving chase, the other 4 dogs just stayed right where they were. As the medical examiner's report would later show, the single bullet that killed Judy entered her body just under her right armpit before exiting through her left rear shoulder, ricocheting off the maple tree 37 feet away and landing in the sodden leaves where Dan Castle would discover it 14 days later. On its way through the soft tissues of Judy's chest cavity, the bullet basically tore off the top of Judy's heart. After the bullet had struck and killed Judy, she fell on her side at a right angle to the trail, her head on a slight rise and her feet in a pool of icy water. All 4 of her dogs would stay close to her body for another 2 hours. That's when Judy's mother would also walk into the woods looking for Judy and blow the dog whistle that finally called the dogs home. There was nothing Judy's killer could do to retrieve the bullet they had fired, but the killer had made sure to collect the spent shell casing before leaving the woods. Later, the killer would use a torch to destroy the gun and shell casing before disposing of the weapon in the nearby Ford River. On December 13th, 14 days after Judy's murder, Gail Lampinen decided to open the 5 boxes that had been left on her doorstep the day before. Happily married, Gail had already confided to her husband about the unwanted attention she had been receiving at work, and now apparently at home. But looking down at the pile of cardboard boxes at her feet, Gail was forced to admit that unwanted attention was an understatement. This looked more like the behavior of a full-blown stalker. Taking the first box into her bedroom, Gail opened it and looked inside. Neatly folded and packed, she saw a collection of women's sweaters in various styles and colors, but as Gail took each sweater out of the box, she realized they were not new sweaters. And a moment later, she pulled out a piece of yellow-lined notepaper. It was a letter addressed to her, dated 6 months earlier, and it was signed by Judy Moylannon, a woman, as Gail well knew, who was now dead. Gail had hardly finished reading the note before her hand was on the telephone, and a few minutes later, she was connected to Detective Ball's office, where she left a detailed message for the investigator. The letter may have been signed by Judy Moylannon, but there was no doubt in Gail's mind who the real author was. It was the same man who had left those boxes, the same man who had been sending her suggestive cards and notes, stopping by her office and showing up unannounced at the Lampinen house. It was, in fact, the same man who had been bragging to her just a few days ago that before long he'd be quitting his job as a technician at Marquette General Hospital thanks to a financial windfall that was about to make him a very wealthy man. And when Detective Ball returned to his office and called Gail back, he could practically hear the last few pieces of the puzzle fall into place. It would take months to prove their case, but Detective Ball and his team of investigators now had the bullet, the gun, the motive, and the evidence they needed to bring Bruce Moylannon, Judy's husband and killer, to justice. It would turn out the Moylannons' financial problems could all be traced to Bruce's poor money management, bad business decisions, and potentially fraudulent activity involving his insurance company, North County Claim Service. But Judy had only recently become aware of just how bad their money situation was. It was only when the couple's application to refinance their home was turned down that Judy had called the bank and realized that because of Bruce's money mismanagement, the family was facing possible bankruptcy and legal action. And, as Judy confided to a close friend, over the following weeks, Judy was learning more and more things about Bruce that made her scared and unhappy. Meanwhile, when Judy confronted Bruce about their precarious financial situation, Bruce became convinced that Judy would divorce him and take half of all of his assets. To Bruce, a much better option was to kill his wife and make it look like an accident. And while Bruce had insisted to police that the payout on Judy's insurance policies could hardly amount to more than $40,000, when police had searched Bruce's house in mid-December, they realized he was lying. While no single insurance policy on Judy was worth a fortune, Bruce had made sure he had taken out multiple policies on his wife. Hidden in an attic crawl space in the Moylannon house, Detective Ball had found a whole packet of those policies. And in the event of an accidental death, when the payout doubled, like a deer hunting fatality, when you added all the policies together, Bruce stood to walk away from Judy's death with a total of more than $300,000, an amount that would be worth $637,000 in 2022. The Moylannons' paperwork also revealed that in addition to a financial motive for wanting Judy dead, Bruce did in fact own a rifle that could have fired the fatal bullet that Dan Castle recovered. Listed as one of Bruce's assets on a loan application was a Remington 300 Savage, one of the weapons that the state crime lab said could have caused the distinctive riflings on the bullet that killed Judy. As for Bruce's alibi, he lied about that too. And once police interviewed every person on Bruce's list, they realized Bruce could not account for where he was between 1:45 and 2:45 on the afternoon that Judy was killed. But even though recent financial problems may have pushed Bruce and Judy to the breaking point, serious problems in the marriage had shown up at least 2 years earlier. That's when Bruce met Gail Lampinen at Portage Hospital when he was making a delivery there. Known throughout the hospitals in the area as an aggressive and awkward flirt, Bruce seemed to have fallen especially hard for Gail, even though she and her husband did their best to discourage Bruce from visiting and calling Gail. And once Judy was dead, Bruce launched an all-out romantic assault on Gail, one so obvious it prompted that first anonymous tip to police in Marquette, in which the caller reported that Bruce was stalking a hospital employee. As for the letter Gail had found, enclosed with the boxes of sweaters Bruce had dropped off at the Lampinen house, Bruce, writing as Judy, told Gail that the couple had grown apart and would soon be getting a divorce, and that Bruce would need Gail's help in finding a new partner, a woman exactly like Gail herself. But even without the handwriting analysis that confirmed Bruce was the author of the so-called sweater letter, it was the postscript at the end of the note that convinced Gail that Bruce had written the letter as a way of speaking directly to her. Quote, P.S. Don't tell the prospects, but believe it or not, Bruce is incredible in the sack. Not that Gail was the only target of Bruce's unwanted advances. The day after Judy's funeral, Bruce also started hitting on Judy's best childhood friend, Leanne Wysocki, a nurse at Marquette General Hospital, even going so far as to suggest that she might want to move in with him and 3-year-old Elise. And as Leanne reported to Detective Ball in late December, Bruce had told Leanne details about the shooting that had not been made public and that only Judy's killer would know, like exactly how the bullet had entered Judy's body just when her arm was swinging back, and how it was the perfect timing of that shot that resulted in the massive internal injuries that killed his wife. It would also turn out that Bruce may have made 2 earlier attempts on Judy's life. Back in 1991, so a year before Judy was killed, he apparently pushed an 85-pound chimney block off the roof of their house onto Judy's head. If the block had not glanced off of her head, Judy likely would have died rather than sustaining a severe concussion that put her in the hospital for 3 days with no memory of what had happened to her and a 5-inch gash on her scalp. A few months after that, Judy woke up one morning and found the house full of smoke. It would turn out that before leaving to go hunting, while Judy and Elise were still both asleep, Bruce had dropped live embers from the wood stove onto a pile of dry firewood in the basement. But despite the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence against him, it wasn't until Bruce failed a lie detector test and police showed him a copy of the sweater letter that he had written to Gail that Judy's husband finally confessed to killing his wife. On April 23, 1993, 5 months after Judy's death, Bruce told investigators, and later Judy's own brother David, that Bruce just couldn't take it anymore and suddenly went nuts. He told Detective Ball that in addition to threatening him with divorce, Judy had been a tyrant whose long workdays forced Bruce to do more than his fair share of the cooking and childcare. As for the timing of Judy's murder, Bruce said that it was just a lucky guess that Judy would go out that afternoon to walk the dogs. He said that the first time Judy had passed him on the path in the woods, that he just couldn't bring himself to shoot her. And then on her return trip, he said he aimed the rifle once and then lowered it and then raised it one more time, closed his eyes, and pulled the trigger. On December 15, 1993, Bruce Moylanen was convicted of premeditated first-degree murder. He would later be sentenced to life in prison without parole. The only time Bruce showed any emotion during his trial was when Gail Lampinen took the stand to testify against him, at which point Bruce began to sob uncontrollably. Judy's brother, David Blake, and his wife, Yvonne, adopted and raised the Moylanens' little girl, Elise. Judy's mother, Marianne Blake, died at the age of 71 on November 29, 2007, exactly 15 years to the day that her only daughter was murdered. In 2008, 22-year-old Julian Buchwald was living in a small rural town in southern Australia called Budgeree. He lived there with his parents, who owned a small house on a massive 1,200-acre plot of land, which for reference is about 2 square miles. However, this land was made up mostly of thick brush and forested areas, so for the most part, they just stayed close to their actual house. However, there was a waterfall deep into the woods on their property that periodically they would go to visit. Less than a 20-minute drive north of Budgeree was another small rural town called Churchill, and in that town was Julian's girlfriend, 17-year-old Carolyn Watson, who also lived with her parents. The young couple had met 2 years earlier at the church they both went to. They were both very devout Christians, and their plan was to get married the next year when Carolyn turned 18 and was done with her studies. On Tuesday, March 4th of that year, Julian and Carolyn decided to go out and have a picnic lunch at the waterfall on Julian's family's property. So, early that afternoon, Julian left his house, he hopped in the family car, he drove north to Churchill, he picked up Carolyn, and then he drove her back to his family's property, where he turned onto a dirt road that would take them into the forest to the waterfall. At some point along this short, bumpy road through the forest, Julian was looking out ahead of the car when he spotted what looked like roadkill on the side of the road. And this roadkill, it looked bigger than he was used to seeing in this area. And so he stared at it as the car kind of rolled past it. And right after they had driven past the roadkill, he turned to Carolyn and said, hey, there's some really weird roadkill on the side of the road right over there. And so Carolyn, who really didn't care, she kind of slowly looked up and turned around and looked, but she didn't see it. And then after that, the two of them did not discuss the roadkill any further. And so Julian just continued to drive along this dirt road until the road kind of opened up into this big clearing. And in the middle of this clearing, which was basically this field, there was a small pond with a 10-foot-high waterfall feeding into it. This was the waterfall. And so Julian parked the car right at the end of the dirt road, right on the edge of this clearing, and he and Carolyn got out. They went around to the back of the car, they got their picnic supplies out of the trunk, and they set up their picnic lunch right on the edge of this pond, looking up at this waterfall. And they were there for about an hour, just kind of enjoying each other's company. And then around 2:30 p.m., they realized it was time to go because they had told their family they'd be back by 3. And so they packed up all of their picnic stuff. They went back to the car. They put it back in the trunk. They hopped back inside the car. Julian turned it on. He turned the car around, and they began driving back down the dirt road that had brought them in. And as soon as they began driving down this road, Julian remembered the strange roadkill he had seen on their way in. And he decided that he wanted to stop and get out and actually go up to it. And so as they're driving along, he looks over at Carolyn and says, "Hey, do you mind if I stop the car when I see the roadkill so I can go look at it?" Carolyn looked at him and she's like, "Okay, but remember, we have to be back by 3 p.m. That's what we told our families, so please be quick." And so Julian said, "No problem." And so he continued driving along, scanning for this roadkill. But after driving for several minutes, he had not found the roadkill yet, and he started to become worried that he had just driven past it without realizing it. And so he stopped the car. They're pretty close to the end of this dirt road. They're almost back to Julian's property, but he stops the car right in the middle of this dirt road, and he turns to Carolyn and says, "Hey, I think I drove past it. Do you mind if I just hop out and run back?" And so Carolyn was totally annoyed that this roadkill viewing was really becoming quite involved. But she says, "Okay, go, but again, you gotta be quick because, it's almost 3 p.m. And so Julian kind of grinned at her. He put the car in park and he hopped out, he turned, and he began jogging back down the road in the direction of the waterfall. And after jogging for maybe 30 seconds or so, the road had turned to the right. And so from where he was on the road, if he turned around, he would not have been able to see his car or Carolyn. He was kind of deep in the thick of this forest. But he knew, this road is not very long, and so I'm sure the roadkill has got to be up here somewhere. And so he decided he would just continue running back along this road for maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, and if he didn't find the roadkill by then, he'd just have to give up, turn around, and head back to the car. And so he began jogging, continuing towards the waterfall on this dirt road, and sure enough, after about a minute, he spots off to the side the roadkill. And so he runs up to it, and right away he sees it's this huge animal that's right on the side of the road. There was a branch from a tree that had kind of obscured the carcass a little bit, and he figured that's why on the return trip he hadn't seen it, because this branch was kind of blocking it from view. And so standing over it, still not even sure what it is, he reached down and he moved the branch, the tree branch, out of the way to get a better look at this big dead animal. And right as he did that, everything went black. A few minutes later, Carolyn, who was still sitting in the car waiting for her boyfriend to come back, looked at her watch and realized it was getting really close to 3 p.m. and still Julian was not back yet. And so feeling kind of annoyed with him, she sat up in her seat and turned around and looked out the rear window of the car, expecting to see Julian come bounding down the road toward her. But when she looked out the back window, all she saw was this dirt road that kind of bent off to the right out of view and thick trees everywhere. Her boyfriend is nowhere to be seen. Annoyed, she turned back around and sat facing forward again, but began periodically looking in the side view mirror, expecting Julian to pop up at any moment. But after several more minutes went by and still Julian had not come back yet, her annoyance turned into concern. Was Julian actually okay? And so she decided, it's almost 3 p.m. now. We got to get back. I need to get out and actually go investigate and see what's going on with Julian and this roadkill. And so she opened her car door, she stepped outside, she stood up, she turned, and she looked down the road in the direction it turned to the right towards the waterfall, and she froze. Because there was something standing right in the middle of the road that her brain simply couldn't process. She wanted to turn and run. She wanted to scream for help, but she couldn't. She was just frozen with fear, staring at this thing in the middle of the road. And then seconds later, this thing that she saw in the road began moving toward her. Around 3:30 p.m. that day, Julian's mother, who was at the house, realized her son had still not come back from his picnic. And this was very unlike him. He was extremely punctual. And so she stepped out onto the front porch to wait for him. But after waiting on the front porch for 30 minutes and him not showing up again, she got really concerned. And so she left the porch and went down onto their driveway, and their driveway extended right up to the main road that ran along the front of the house. And when she reached the top of her driveway, she just turned and watched down the main road, waiting for her son to come back. Because in order to get to the waterfall, you had to get on this main road and then turn onto that dirt road that was a little ways down this main road. And so she's just standing there looking down the road, waiting for her son, but he's still not coming out of that dirt road. And as she's looking in this direction, she happens to glance along the chain link fence that ran along the front of her property. And she noticed there was a plastic bottle that had been jammed through one of the chain links. And so she decided she would just go over and see what it was, because it didn't make any sense that there would be a bottle in her fence. And so she walks over, she pulls the bottle out of the fence, and she realizes there is a tightly rolled piece of paper that's inside of the bottle. And so she unscrews the cap, she turns the bottle over, and she pours this little piece of paper out. She unfurls the piece of paper and sees there's writing on it. And as she's reading it, her heart starts to race and she covers her mouth. This note was clearly intended for her to read, or someone in the family to read that day, because it was about what happened to Julian and Carolyn that day. The note, which was covered in all these strange satanic symbols and was barely understandable because the grammar and spelling was so terrible, it generally communicated that Julian and Carolyn, who they called the boy and the girl, had been kidnapped. And so long as the family did not contact police, they, the boy and the girl, Julian and Carolyn, would be returned. It didn't really specify what they were going to do to them, and there was no ransom. It basically just said, you better not tell police or else. Well, Julian's mother was terrified. She had no idea what to do, and despite this threat of some sort of harm to her children, to her family, if she went to police, she still called the police. And so the police, they came out to her property, they inspected the note, and right away, they noticed at the bottom of the note, it was signed with the initials ONA. And so those initials, combined with these strange satanic symbols all over it, led police to discover who ONA was. ONA was a cult. It was the Order of Nine Angles, and they are a self-professed satanic cult that operates primarily in Europe, but also has chapters in the United States, in Canada, in Russia, and also in Australia. This cult believes that Christians are the enemy of the world, and they need to be destroyed in order to institute a militaristic New World Order they called the Imperium. And if that wasn't frightening enough, this cult openly advocates for, and apparently practices, human sacrifice. They have come out and said the people they kill in these sacrifices are people they consider lesser thans, basically the bad people of society. And if you are an ONA cult member, then who better to sacrifice than Julian and Carolyn, two devout Christians, and so two clear enemies of the ONA. Now, at first, when the police saw this note and kind of put this together, they're thinking, this has got to be a prank. I mean, Carolyn and Julian have only been gone for a couple of hours at this point, and all we have is this note in a bottle stuck into the fence. This does not seem like some huge conspiracy of a cult coming in here and snatching these kids to commit some human sacrifice. But when Carolyn's parents found out about this note and how they were still missing, they would tell the police, 10 days ago, we received a letter in the mail that had strange satanic symbols all over it, and it really didn't make any sense. It basically was threatening them not to go to police, but 10 days ago, they had no reason to go to police, and so they just didn't really understand why they received this message or who had sent it, and so they had just kind of dismissed it and not told anyone. But now, with these two notes looking nearly identical, it seemed fairly obvious that whether it was the ONA or some other person or group, whoever was behind the kidnapping of Julian and Carolyn had clearly been watching both of their properties prior to the attack, which meant this was likely a more sophisticated kidnapping. So that evening, the police launched this huge air and land search all over Julian's family's property, but despite looking everywhere, they found no sign of the young couple. There was just nothing. And over the next few days, when still there was just no sign of Julian or Carolyn, and there was no more word coming in from ONA, there were no more bottles stuck in fences or stuck in mailboxes, the police began to prepare for the worst. Then something totally unexpected happened. On March 11th, so 7 days after Carolyn and Julian went missing, a farmer was driving along this winding back road up in the mountains right near Alpine National Park. Alpine National Park is this very rugged, mountainous place that's about 250 miles to the north of Budgery. And so as this guy is driving along this road, which is very heavily forested on either side, he sees up ahead this young man and young woman who are barely wearing any clothes come stumbling out of the forest and kind of plop down on the side of the road. And so concerned they're hurt or they're lost or something, the farmer rolled right up next to them and he rolled his window down and asked, hey, are you guys okay? And they got up and they kind of stumbled their way over to the car and they introduced themselves as Carolyn and Julian and they pleaded for his help. And so the farmer helped them into his car and he drove them to the hospital. It wasn't long before the police in Budgery learned that Carolyn and Julian had been found and they were alive. And so very quickly they rushed up to that hospital near the national park. And when they got there, they spoke to doctors who would say, Carolyn and Julian are very traumatized. They're horribly sunburned. They're covered in bug bites. They got cuts and bruises all over them, but they're okay. They're going to survive. And so the police went into Julian and Carolyn's room, and at first, they just talked to them for a couple of minutes to really see that they were okay. And after feeling pretty confident that they were, they said, look, I don't mean to just jump right into the trauma you've just experienced, but we really need any information you can give us about what just happened. Who did this to you? Who brought you out here? Because if it's ONA and they're out in the Alpine National Park, we need to know about it. We need to get out there and we need to stop them. And so Julian and Carolyn would both independently sit down and tell the police what happened to them. And so the following is the combined story of these two accounts that they gave police. 7 days earlier, when Julian had gotten out of the car and ran back down the road to that dead animal on the side of the road, and he had reached down to kind of get that branch out of the way to get a better look at this thing, he heard sudden movement behind him, and as he turned, he didn't have a chance to see what was behind him, but he felt something hard smash him in the back of the head, and it knocked him unconscious. When he woke up, he knew right away that a significant amount of time had passed, that he had been unconscious for what must have been several hours, because now it was dark out, and when he was struck, it was broad daylight, and he looked around him, and he had no idea where he was. He was in the middle of this forest, he had no clothes on, his wrists and his ankles were tied together, and he moved around, and he realized he had been tied to a tree that was right behind him. And so he's got no idea what's going on. He has no idea where he is. He's looking around. He doesn't see anyone. And then amazingly, when he looks down, right next to him, underneath some leaves, is a knife. And so he's thinking, how in the world is there a knife right next to me? This almost seems like it was placed to be here for me. But either way, he reaches down with his hands, he picks this knife up, and he's able to cut the restraints off of his ankles, and then he's able to cut the restraints off of his waist, and then he stands up and he's able to kind of cut off the ones on his wrist, and then he's free. And so he takes this knife, and he has no idea where he's going, but he needs to get away. He doesn't know if whoever brought him here is going to come back. And so he just picks a direction and he starts running. Shortly after Julian had been struck in the back of the head after looking at that dead animal carcass, Carolyn was still sitting in the car and she was starting to get annoyed and kind of worried about Julian. And so she gets out of the car, she stands up, she turns, and she looks down the dirt road where it kind of bends off to the right. And standing in the road, maybe 10 feet away from her, is this man wearing all black. He's got a black balaclava over his face, and he's looking right at her. And so she's so scared, she just frozen to the spot. And then this guy charges her, he tackles her to the ground. And then once she's on the ground, he rips all her clothes off. And then he binds her wrists, her ankles, he ties them together so she's hogtied. And then he puts a blindfold around her eyes. And so she's lying on the road, she can't move, she can't see anything, and she hears her attacker run off down the road. And then a couple of minutes later, she hears a car approaching, and it stops right near her. And then she hears the sound of a car door opening, someone walking up to her, and then they pick her up and they put her in the trunk of this car. They shut the trunk, and then the car kicks into gear and it starts driving away. And so for hours and hours, she lay in the trunk in this horrible position where the circulation to her wrists and to her ankles were cut off. And so she's getting shooting pain in her limbs, and it's totally uncomfortable. And then after several hours, the car eventually turns on to some really bumpy road, and then it comes to a stop. And then she hears the sound of the driver open the door. They walk around to the back of the car, the trunk pops open, and then this person pulls the blindfold off of her eyes. And she sees, even though her eyes are taking a second to adjust, that it's the man with the balaclava on, and he picks her up and he throws her on the ground. And then after he shuts the trunk, he walks over to Carolyn and he grabs her by the wrists and he begins dragging her into the woods. And so as she's being dragged, Carolyn is thinking, I'm about to be killed somewhere in the middle of the woods. There's nothing I can do. I can't go anywhere. I can't do anything. And after several minutes of being dragged, she gets dropped. And then this man with the balaclava, he walks back to the car and he gets a shovel. And when he walks over to her, he makes a special point of showing her the shovel. And then he rolls her onto her side so she's positioned in such a way that she can see what he's doing. And then right in front of her, he takes that shovel and he begins digging a hole in the ground. And so Carolyn's watching him and she's thinking, he's digging my grave. And so for several hours, Carolyn just laid there wondering what was going to happen to her as this guy dug this hole deeper and deeper into the ground. And then finally, when the hole was apparently deep enough, the guy got out of the hole, he dumped the shovel, he walked over to her, he picked her up, and he threw her into the hole. And so Carolyn at this point is literally anticipating death at any moment. She doesn't know how he's going to kill her, but she thinks it's going to happen any minute. And so she wriggles herself onto her knees and does the only thing she can think to do, which is just to pray. And so as she's sitting there kneeling and praying, she hears the sound of her attacker walking off. Now, the hole was deep enough that she actually could not see where he was going, but she could clearly tell he was walking away. It was almost like her prayer had been answered, that this guy was going to leave her alone. But even with this guy potentially gone, she was still in a perilous situation because she's stuck in this hole. She can't go anywhere. She's still tied up, and the temperatures are dropping rapidly, and she's got no clothes on. After Julian had managed to free himself from his restraints with that knife that he found, and after he had turned and just started running in a general direction, he had begun yelling out for help. He knew that by yelling out, he very likely could be alerting the person who had brought him here, but he's thinking, it's freezing, I don't have clothes on, I have to get help right now, and maybe Carolyn is out there. And so he's just kind of yelling out for help. And at some point, a voice yells back to him, and it's a voice he knows very well. It's Carolyn. And so in the darkness, he's kind of fumbling through all the trees, and he's listening for Carolyn's voice. And finally, he reaches her, and he finds her in this hole, hogtied, screaming out for him. And so there's this moment where he kind of explains what happened to him, and she's trying to explain what happened to her, but they're just so scared that this attacker is going to come back that Julian just hops into the hole, he cuts the restraints, and then Julian helps Carolyn out of the hole. And at this point, Carolyn can barely walk because the circulation had been cut off for the most part to her legs for the better part of 6, 7, 8 hours at this point. But still, they're desperate to get out of here, so Julian's kind of holding Carolyn up, and they begin to walk away from this hole site. And as they're leaving, they begin scanning around the area in case, this attacker has left something else on the ground, because Julian had said, I found a knife near where I was being held. And sure enough, as they're leaving, not far from the hole, they spot lying up against a tree a sleeping bag, and rolled up inside of the sleeping bag was some food and some water. And so Julian and Carolyn, they can't understand how in the world this has happened. Both the horrible luck of being kidnapped and brought out here, and the unbelievable luck of finding life-saving supplies just laying nearby. But either way, they grab the sleeping bag, they grab the food and water, and they take off running. For the next 48 hours, the couple roasted during the daytime when the sun was out because the temperatures would climb significantly. There wasn't much shade where they were walking around, so they're getting horribly sunburned. And then at night, the temperatures would plummet and they'd be freezing cold, and they'd get inside of their one sleeping bag and they'd shiver together and do their best to ration some food and water. And they're telling themselves, to stay positive, that eventually if they just keep on moving every day, they're going to find a person, they're going to find a road, they're going to find something that will save them. But to their horror, at the end of those first 48 hours, as they're stumbling through this mountainous, treacherous terrain, they found themselves stumbling back into the same area they had tried to run away from. There was the hole in the ground where Carolyn had been thrown inside of. They had accidentally, over the past 2 days, walked in a big circle. Now, luckily, when they arrived back at this site, there was no one there. The attacker was long gone. And it would turn out this accident likely saved their lives, because as they looked at this site, they saw propped up against a tree was a backpack. And so they ran over to the backpack, they opened it up, and there was food, water, some clothing, and a map of the area. Now, again, the couple is totally dumbfounded why they are just happening to find these life-saving supplies right when they need them. But at the same time, they're thinking, okay, well, if these supplies are sitting here, then certainly the person who has left them here, their attacker, they're going to be back soon. And so they just grabbed the backpack with everything inside of it and they took off running. And for the next 5 days, they used that map as best as they could, and they eventually stumbled their way through the terrain, roasting during the daytime and freezing at night. And eventually, they reached that road where they stumbled out, and the farmer driving along the back road, he spotted them, and he brought them to the hospital. After hearing this story, the police very quickly organized a massive search around the area of Alpine National Park where the farmer picked up Julian and Carolyn, because they're thinking, okay, it's got to be right around here that we'll find the man in the balaclava that might lead us to the ONA, or maybe he's not connected to the ONA, but whoever he is, we need to find this guy. And so the police, they go out, they do this huge search. They don't find the man with the balaclava. They don't find any sign of the ONA, but they do find that area where that hole had been dug that Carolyn had been thrown in. And when they searched that area, they found the shovel, they found some rope, and they found some duct tape. And when they brought that in to be examined, they couldn't believe what they discovered. All of those items belonged to Julian, which meant either the kidnapper had taken all of these supplies from Julian right before going out and perpetrating this kidnapping, or, much more likely, Julian had supplied these things to the kidnapper and so was involved in some way in this kidnapping. And so the police went to Julian and confronted him with this information and said, "You're not telling us everything because these are your items." And at first, Julian would completely deny any accusations that he had anything to do with this. But after some very serious police pressure was put on him, he cracked. The following is the real story of what happened. Back on March 4th, so the day that Julian and Carolyn went missing, Julian, after picking Carolyn up, they made it onto that dirt road that led into the forest towards the waterfall, and as they're driving along, Julian claimed to have seen some roadkill, some very strange roadkill on the side of the road. And so when Carolyn kind of turned around to look and didn't see it, Julian made it seem like, oh, we drove past it, that's why you didn't see it. But in reality, there was never any roadkill. That was completely made up. There was no roadkill. All Julian was doing was creating something that would allow him to then get out of the car at the end of their trip. And so they drive the rest of the way into the waterfall, they have their picnic, they turn around, they head back, and then again, Julian says, "Hey, Carolyn, do you mind if I, get out to look at the roadkill?" And so she says yes. And then he acts like, "Oh, we must have driven past it, so I need to get out and run back if I want to go see it." So Carolyn, she's not thinking it's totally strange. She says, "Okay." And so he hops out and he runs his way. He goes around that curve in the road out of sight. There's no roadkill. Instead, he makes his way to a tree where days earlier he had stashed his all-black outfit, his black balaclava, and his knife, his shovel, his rope, his duct tape. It was all stashed in this spot that was going to be out of view of where Carolyn was. And so after getting all dressed up, he turned and began walking back towards Carolyn and his car. And when he turned the corner, he saw Carolyn was already standing outside of the car. And so he charged her, he tackled her to the ground, he ripped her clothes off, he hog-tied her, he threw her in his car, and then he got all of his supplies, he threw those in the car too, and he began driving away. And for 6 hours, he drove north all the way up to Alpine National Park. And then when he got there, he found a road that would kind of go off the trail a ways into the forest, at which point he opened the trunk, he pulled Carolyn out, he threw her on the ground, he dragged Carolyn into the woods, and then with her blindfold off, he made sure to show her the shovel, and he began digging that hole to give her the impression that he was going to kill her and bury her. He really wanted her to be totally terrified. And then after he had dug this hole, he dumped her into the hole. And then when she couldn't see what he was doing because she's deep inside of this hole and she's all tied up, he ran away. And when he was far enough out of view, he took off all of his clothes and kind of stashed it near a tree. And then completely naked, besides his knife, which would be his alibi for how he had gotten free, he began moving back towards the site where he knew Carolyn was in this hole. And then after waiting a little bit, he began yelling out for help. And then she heard him. And so she yells back to him, "Yo, Julian, I'm over here." And so Julian goes to the sound of her voice, and then when he sees her, he pitches her this ridiculous story about how he was tied up over there, but he found this knife, and he was able to cut himself free, and look, I'll cut you free, and oh, the attacker's gonna come back soon. And so he helps her out of the hole, and oh, look, they left a sleeping bag and some food and water, let's go. And so he grabs the supplies, and they head off into the bush. Now, the whole time, over the course of these 7 days, Julian knew exactly where he was. And so when they accidentally went in a circle and arrived back at the site where the hole was and then found that backpack that had more food and more water and some more supplies, that was intentional. That was not an accident. He had left the backpack there, and so that's why they had doubled back. And then 5 days later, after scampering through the wilderness, they magically found the road. But again, Julian knew where the road was. He had intentionally stayed out for the days that they were out there. And so after Julian tells the police all this, they say to him, was Carolyn in on this? I mean, did she know this was going on? And he said no. The whole time she believed they were getting stalked by their attacker. And if they ever caught up to them, they would be killed. And so the police are like, okay, well, why did you do this? Julian would say, he and Carolyn were both very committed to their faith, and they both believed in not having sex before marriage. But over time, Julian had gotten to the point where he just couldn't wait any longer to have sex with Carolyn, and they weren't scheduled to get married for another year. And he just did not think he could wait a full year before they could finally have intercourse. And so he had staged this entire kidnapping in order to hopefully coerce Carolyn into having sex with him. And so while he and Carolyn were out on the run in Alpine National Park for those 7 days and nights, they were not wearing any clothes or barely wearing any clothes, and at night they only had that one sleeping bag that Julian had intentionally staged in advance. He knew they would have that one sleeping bag, and so they would climb into that bag at night because it's freezing cold out, and as they're laying there right on top of each other, he would say to Carolyn, "We need to have sex in order to produce enough heat that we don't freeze to death out here." But Carolyn, despite the circumstances, every time said no. And so after 7 days of trying to convince Carolyn that they had to have sex, it was a matter of life or death, and that if they just said their vows, that under the eyes of God, they would be considered married and sex would be okay at that point, despite all of his best efforts, every single time Carolyn just continued to say no, no, no. And so at the end of those 7 days, Julian finally just gave up. and so that's when they magically made their way out to the road and were rescued. Julian would also tell police that he was the one who wrote those notes prior to the kidnapping in hopes that they would believe the Order of the Nine Angles was behind all of this and he wouldn't get in trouble. Prior to his trial for kidnapping, Julian was out on bail and he decided he would just try to flee Australia. And so the way he did this is he dyed his skin a darker shade, and he also dyed his hair darker, and then he attempted to use a fake Indian passport to go to India. And he was able to fool Australian authorities, but when he arrived in India, he was immediately found out and he was extradited back to Australia where he would stand trial. And in 2009, he was found guilty of kidnapping along with a host of other obscure charges, and he was sentenced to 7 years and 9 months in Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the 5-star review button to come on over your house for a nice, fun, casual game night, and as soon as they step inside, immediately ambush them, handcuff them to the bed, and then have a priest perform an exorcism on them. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen Podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you find your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.